Hello and welcome to section 12, which is television's role in society, part 1. I hope everyone had a good spring break, and now we're back in the action and trying to finish off this semester. So what we're going to do, looking at, let me switch back here, looking at television is we're going to view it from two different perspectives. One that's a little bit more negative and one that's a little more positive. So the first perspective is that the media is a method for those in power to control us, and we'll be talking primarily about that today. And then we'll finish off with talking about how there is a beneficial aspect of television, and that there's something shared in watching it together. We can come together as a society, and television can be used as a forum for discussion. So the first perspective that we're going to look at is the manipulative power of television and how that can be a harmful force. And so we're going to look from the perspective of this scholar named Herbert Schiller, who lived from 1919 to 2000. He taught at University of California, San Diego, and probably most well known for this book that he published in '72, which was called The Mind Managers. And he relies heavily on the theory of hegemony. And if you remember, hegemony is what Gramsci theorized about, talking about how the elites use the institutions of the state to manipulate and control the masses, and how the masses really don't even understand or acknowledge the full extent to which they are being manipulated. So the current status quo, or the state, is manipulating people, and the people are almost unaware or ignorant of it. So what Schiller's arguing is that media managers, in particular, with this book, he's talking about how the media controls the images that we see and the information that we get, and therefore the media managers really have control in shaping society's beliefs and behaviors, because the media managers are providing the information to us. They are providing the images to us. So what we know about our world is how they present the world to us. And the dominant elites, just like in hegemony, dominant elites try to conform the masses so that they're manipulated more easily. And Schiller goes on and has a very cynical outlook as to America and the American dream. And he says, we're always just fed enough of that American dream to continue to believe in it. But it's not, the American dream does not happen as often as we'd like. That, in Schiller's mind, someone would say that, as long as you work hard, you can always make it. Schiller would argue that, well, some of us are born with disadvantages that make it harder for us to make it. And maybe those disadvantages are so powerful that it really hinders us from attaining our end goal. That, if you're born poor, sure, you can work your way up to middle class or to riches or whatever, but you also need to acknowledge that you're going to be raised in a poor neighborhood. You're going to be raised around other people who are struggling, and that sometimes that situation leads to someone making choices that kind of kills the American dream for them. And so what Schiller argues is that, television and the media gives us just enough hope in the American dream. It provides us stories, whether they be fictional or nonfiction, that give us just enough hope in that American dream that we continue to move forward, and we don't rebel against society and try to change our society, because we rather choose to be just content with what we have. So what Schiller does is he comes up with 5 myths, and we won't get to all of them today. In fact, this will kind of be a shorter lecture, and then the next one will kind of be short too. But sometimes these concepts and these myths that he talks about can get pretty deep. So I wanted to give them a fair shake and split this over two actual lectures. So the first myth that Schiller talks about, these are things that keep us content, and in particular, it's things that the media does to help us stay content. So myth number 1 is the myth of individualism and personal choice. So what Schiller's talking about with this is that, if you think about it, ever since were a little kid growing up, you're always told you're special and that you're unique and you can do whatever you want to do, and you can earn as much money as you want to earn, and you can buy whatever you want to buy as long as you have the money, and that you are unique, you're an individual. And Schiller says the media just kind of inflates that, right? So we see rags to riches stories on television. We see where people work hard for themselves and earn things for themselves. We see things like MTV Cribs, which I remember, which just shows you kind of the luxury that some people can live in and some people attain. And how when you have that individualism, you have that money, personal choice becomes a big thing, right? I mean, you hear all the time, not to try to make this too political, but think about in terms of, let's say, public school and then private school, and even further than private school, think about like charter schools. So think about how this education system right now is being debated, that of course everyone has access to public education, but if you want to take those tax dollars and you personally make a choice to put your child into a charter school or a private school, you should have that opportunity. You should have that ability. That being said, not everyone's going to have the opportunity, the money to put their kid into a charter school or into a private school, right? Personal choice. If you can make that personal choice, you probably have a financial way of doing that, right? Of making that decision whether the kid goes public or private. I myself went to a private school. It was not because my parents were rich by any means, but it's the school that I went to is a leftover of Southern segregation, and that can get into a long argument. But we see schools right now in the South that are private, and they are predominantly white, and there's a reason why that is. Still, my family decided to put me in one of those schools, which meant they had to pay. So they paid a tuition for me to go to that little bitty school in the rural South. But they had that choice. There's several families in my area that did not have that choice, right? They didn't have jobs that paid them enough that they could save and sacrifice that money. We also see right now, one of the things that I've recently complained about, and I know you hear it all the time, being millennials, is that you're all snowflakes and you've all been coddled and you haven't had any kind of face any roughness in life, and you expect everything to be given to you. These are all things that people say about millennials. And when I say people say about millennials, I mean old people say about millennials. Even my generation talks bad about the current generation. And a lot of that comes, I think, from this seeing that children now are coddled and protected way more than they used to be. And I'm trying to finish my thought on that. Where I was going with that is also this whole self-esteem movement that kind of came about in the 80s and then kind of blossomed in the 90s, and then after 2000 it just kind of ran rampant. And what I mean by that, this self-esteem movement is participation trophies, how everyone gets a trophy no matter how the team did. I remember my daughter beginning to play Little League softball and how they didn't keep score for the longest time until they were much older, and I just thought, well, why aren't we keeping score? Kids need to learn when they're performing better and when they're performing worse. And the value of failing, the value of learning from failure that I felt was not being taught in the same way that it was taught to me. This is all to say and to point to what Schiller's talking about, that there's this myth of individualism, of personal choice, that you're unique. Remember, you are special, you're an individual, just like everyone else. Every parent tells their kid that. You're special, you're unique, right? What Schiller's getting at, to try to bring this home, is that we didn't really get individualism and privacy until, as a society, we were able to gain material rewards, bank money, and have leisure time to spend, right? So what Schiller's getting at with this is that if you look at the evolution of humanity, we evolved in a tribal system. We evolved in a system that said, look out for one another, that everyone will serve a role that benefits the group and not just that individual. If you think about Native American societies, how everyone had a role, whether it be hunter, gatherer, warrior, medicine man, chief, whatever. Everyone had a role, and they played that role for the betterment of the tribe. Early cavemen did the same thing, where people had roles, right? So if you just decided, hey, I just want to wander off and do my own thing, well, as a Native American, you would die. You could not survive just one person against the entire wilderness. You needed community. And so that's what Schiller's trying to say here, is that as we've evolved, we've started to think that we don't need community. It's just the individual. And he's saying that television and the media has just fostered that belief, right? So getting back, people begin to value the individual over the group. And what's best for the group overall is outweighed by what holds most value for the individual. Television provides entertainment. If you think about that and think about how much entertainment television provides as opposed to knowledge, right? If you think about that, you start to see that knowledge is really for the betterment of society. Entertainment is really for the benefit of the person, right? I mean, there is entertainment that makes everyone feel good, or that maybe spurs everyone into action. But for the most part, entertainment is a personal achievement, right? I want to be entertained myself. I don't necessarily care about entertainment for the whole group of people that I'm involved with. When I get home from work, I want to do what I want to do, right? So I seek out entertainment. Whereas Schiller's pitching and saying, really what mass media should do is provide you with knowledge. It should act as a teacher. It's something else that you look at to gain insight into the world. Schiller also makes this point, and I can't remember if we get to it today or in the next lecture, but he'll harp back on this last point on this slide, which is individual freedom gets tied in with personal choice all the time. We can choose what we want to watch on TV. What do I mean by that? People tend to confuse freedom and choice. and they think, well, I have individual freedom. I'm a unique individual. And so I can choose anything I want. I can choose to do anything I want. And what Schiller says is, no, 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 you need to remember there are always constraints on personal choice. You can't do everything that you just want to do. We don't live that way. You can't just decide that you're going to kill someone who upset you that day. There's a restriction on that. You can't just decide that you're going to go into a car lot with $10 in your pocket and buy a Ferrari. That's not going to happen. We all have limitations. Schiller will get to that and say, well, we also say, well, look, I choose what I want to watch on TV. It's my personal choice what I want to consume in the media. And Schiller argues, no, you really are just consuming the options that they give you. And so that's Schiller's argument. The myth of neutrality. Again, remember, these are all things that are supposed to keep us content, that are supposed to keep us kind of zombified, not, I think the term people use now is woke. So Schiller's very, very much arguing that the media does not keep you woke. If there's an opposite to woke, Schiller believes that's what the media is doing. So one of these things is called the myth of neutrality. And that means for manipulation to be effective, and this is also true for hegemony, by the way, for manipulation to be effective, evidence of its presence must be non-existent. So if I want to manipulate you, the easiest, most powerful way to do that is for you not to even realize I'm manipulating you, right? The best persuasion is when you can convince someone that they actually persuaded themselves, right? If you have a brilliant idea and you want someone else to buy into that idea, the easiest way to do that is to help them in saying that they've convinced themselves it's the right thing to do, right? So, in order to do that, evidence of manipulation can't be there. So, you've got to not, as a media manager, as a mind manager, as someone who's trying to keep the status quo, that means that you can't show people the corruption, how deep the corruption goes, how problematic our institutions are. People must believe that their government, their media, their system of education, the institutions of science and medicine, all these key things that we put so much faith in, people have to believe that those things, even science and the pursuit of knowledge, has to be beyond a conflict of interest, right? So you don't show them how the corruption occurs. You don't show them how these systems individually keep failing. And you don't show them that these institutions separately have their own motivations. They want their own things, right? And so, yes, there's conflicts of interest in them. Government, you see political figures all the time in conflicts of interest, but they continue to do what they do. Or an education system that has a conflict of interest. We'll talk about conflicts of interest in the university setting. Things that maybe you haven't thought about but exist and are there. So that's what Schiller is saying, is that the media tries not to show you the extent of that corruption. I won't argue and say that they never show you corruption. Sure they do. But they never really show you the true extent of it. And to back that up, Schiller says, okay, Schiller kind of agrees with the point that I just made, in that, sure, corruption can occur. But the strategy of the media managers, mind managers, according to Schiller, the strategy is that when corruption occurs, it's the fault of the individual, not the institution or the system. Right? So we look at things like the office of the president, okay, the United States president. And when you see problems of corruption there, and this is true of any politician, it's usually phrased as that person was weak themselves. In other words, Nixon, who went through the Watergate scandal and was very vindictive and very vengeful in what he wanted to do with his opponents. He was one of the best political schemers out there, but he was doing bad things. He was breaking laws. And people just explained, well, that was just him. He was a weak man. He was just a corrupt, weak person. Clinton having his affairs while he was president, the Monica Lewinsky thing. Well, that's because Clinton's a weak man. He has these sexual vices as a person, and they were exploited when he was in office. But if you look back at the office of president, you will see that many of these presidents had sexual affairs on the side, right? And we can even go all the way back to Thomas Jefferson having relations with his slaves. We can go forward. FDR, who in my opinion is probably one of the best presidents out there, pulls us out of the Depression, pulls us through World War II, and is dealing with a country in crisis. He had a mistress that his wife knew about, his daughter knew about. Now, you never heard that. You never really knew the extent of that. There wasn't a media system that was hounding him day and night, looking at those issues. JFK, it's well known that he had several affairs in office. And so if we look, maybe we need to stop and think about, were these men weak? Well, possibly, yeah. But could it also be that office, being president of the most powerful country in the world, also tends to make people a little bit selfish, narcissistic, egotistical, makes them think that they can have whatever they want and get away with whatever they want? Maybe it's that old adage about power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We see it in other institutions. To bring this back into the realm of journalism, we have also seen this in reporters or news anchors, broadcasters, people that get so full of themselves that they start losing sight of their responsibilities. For example, Brian Williams on NBC, when he started making up stories about places and things he had done, and then later was called out on it. Well, it turns out if you look into Brian Williams' past and history, he is a newsman, but he also wanted to be an entertainer. When the Jay Leno incident, where Jay Leno was leaving and Conan O'Brien was going to fill that slot, and they had some turnover there and things didn't go the way that NBC wanted it to go, Brian Williams seriously thought that he might be in contention for that late night spot. He would come on as a guest all the time and talk, and he was witty and charming, and people thought, that, well, they were entertained by him. And he started kind of getting addicted to that response of people being entertained and charmed by him. And he wanted that position. And so he starts telling stories that just seem more grandiose and more grandiose and more grandiose because it draws attention to himself. I have Stephen Glass here as the last bullet point. We could use Stephen Glass, who was at the New Republic, also Jason Blair, who was with the New York Times. These are reporters that wrote magnificent pieces. But later on, people realized that some of them just seemed too good to be true. And indeed they were. Both Glass and Jason Blair were making up their stories and putting them in press. But people said, well, these are just weak people. It's not that journalism itself is corrupted. It's not that journalists becoming celebrities corrupts people. It's that these particular people themselves were just conniving and selfish. So Schiller is saying that that's what you do. You take the emphasis away from the institution, you put it more on the individual. The third thing that we'll talk about, and this is actually the last slide, is the myth of unchanging human nature. And so again, these are myths that keep us content, right? So why don't we change things? Why don't we rebel? Why don't we cause a fuss? And Schiller says, well, the media just keeps you thinking that, you know, this is the way things are. This is the way things go. This is how things go over time. The expression he uses here is when human expectations are low, passivity prevails. In other words, if we don't expect any better, then how do we fight injustice? When we see someone treated wrong, we just think, well, that's how the world works. When we see at a university people being mistreated, well, that's just how big old universities are. When we see big corporations treat employees badly, well, that's what you get when you have these big box stores, these big corporations that don't really deal with people. And you get that response so often that people don't think they can make any kind of change. And they don't think that really they should be making change, because that's just the way the world is. And if we look at what television does in particular, there's this argument about people expect blood, guts, and sex, so just give them what they want, right? If sex sells, then we'll just give them sex. They obviously, that's what they want, so we'll give them that. If they want violence, we'll give them that, sure. And if you look at actual, content, yes, television's gotten way more sexualized than it was 40 years ago. Way more violent. Language, nudity, things like that have all, changed dramatically over those 40 years. But it's kind of to the point where no one's done anything. People just sit back and say, well, that's how the media is. They just show you all this stuff. But that's not necessarily true if you think about it. The media is happy. This is the third bullet point. The media is happy to convince you that one person can't change or transform society, right? One person's not going to stop all the sex and nudity on television, right? Until Janet Jackson shows her breast in the Super Bowl, and then everyone in the country called the FCC to say, this wasn't right. My child was watching the Super Bowl, and there's an expectation that a woman's not going to, disrobe during halftime. They're still fighting about that in court, what the actual fine and penalty and all that should be. But that's an instance where people did come together and say, that wasn't right. We're kind of seeing this moment now with guns in America, where, who knows how this will end up, because I've seen it happen this way before, and I'm not sure what actually will be done, if anything will be done. But you see this kind of tipping point where people are like, okay, that was it, right? Now, we also had that after Sandy Hook. We had that after Columbine. We've had that every time. We've said we've had enough. We've had enough of kids being killed in school. But we are making some change. because I don't know if you watched it or not, but there was a town hall after the shootings in Florida in which Marco Rubio showed up and some other politicians showed up, and the place was packed with people that were shouting at these politicians, do something. Change whatever's happening here. You don't have to get rid of the Second Amendment, but do something that keeps kids from being killed. And so you do see that there are people that speak up and want to try to make change. With all the physical change we see, this is what Schiller is talking about. And he's trying to prove a point when he makes this. And he's trying to show you how the media has kept us content. But what he says is that, yes, the world around us has a lot of physical change, right? We have computers now that we didn't have 40 years ago. We have cell phones. We have video games. We have virtual reality. We have every kind of beverage and food you can think of. In the last 50 years, our world physically, yes, has changed very much. And so Schiller says, don't let that deceive you, though. We're still living our lives the same way we did 50 years ago. We still tend to ourselves and not to other people, right? We still work our 8 hours a day, come home, eat dinner, veg out. We still all strive towards having a big house, a nice car. And so Schiller's saying, look, as much as your world you think has changed from, say, your parents' world or your grandparents' world, the basic functions in life have remained the same. And the way that people live their lives have kind of remained the same. So again, Herb Schiller makes the top list of being negative Nancy, but that's his perspective on this. It wasn't Herb Schiller who said this. I'll have to remember who it was, but someone called television this vast wasteland, like a desert that was just nothing worthy in it. Now we'll finish up with Schiller in the next lecture and start getting into people who have more of a positive view of television. So I want you to think about this before we meet for discussion is how do you think television has hurt your generation, but also how has television helped your generation? I may have you do something for participation points along those lines, but I want you to think about how television has hurt your generation, how it's helped your generation, so we can have discussions on that when we meet again. So I will see you all on Monday. Have a good day, weekend, spring break, whatever. Until then.